Starting in the 1960s, American policy toward Latin America could be summed up in 3 words: no more Castros. American leaders had tried to keep Fidel Castro from gaining power in Cuba, had failed. The United States, American leaders had tried to overthrow Castro, had failed. So Castro was there, a thorn in the side of American leaders. American leaders worried a little bit that the Castro revolution would be exported to other parts of Latin America. That was a concern. There was, in the 1950s and 1960s, especially in the 1960s, much of the formerly colonial world was being decolonized. And the newly independent countries of Asia, and especially of Africa, were having to choose between one regime and another regime, one system and the other system. One system was the system of the United States, of democracy and capitalism. The other system was the system of the Soviet Union and China, to the extent that they were still speaking to each other. And this was the system of socialism economically and communism politically. So which one do you want? If you're a newly independent country, if you're the new country of Ghana, or the newly independent country of Nigeria, or the newly independent country of Laos, which do you choose? And to some extent this applies in Latin America as well, although the countries of Latin America had by and large achieved their independence by the mid-19th century. Cuba was a late arrival at independence, not till the 1890s. But still there was this question of which system will we follow? They were independent, so they weren't newly independent, but still there was this model. Do you follow the American model? Do you follow the Soviet model? And this is the era that gives rise to the label Third World. So the United States was nominally the First World. The Soviet Union and its allies were nominally the Second World, although First and Second World were never in common usage. But Third World was. And the Third World was a term that was adopted by a group that called themselves the Non-Aligned Movement. They didn't want to be forced into an alliance with the United States or with the Soviet Union. They wanted to be independent. They wanted to be independent or neutral between these groups. Sometimes they were called the neutralist countries. Sometimes they're called the non-aligned countries. Sometimes they were called the Third World. But the principle was the same all around. They didn't want to be forced to follow the American lead, nor for that matter the Soviet lead. And some of the principal countries of the non-aligned world were India, and in India was the best example. Yugoslavia was another one. And these countries tried to steer a middle course, hoping that they could play one side against the other. They could get good stuff from the Americans, they could get good stuff from the Soviet side. And so, but there was an emphasis on the part of American leaders in the 1950s especially, when the Eisenhower administration tried to force countries to take a side. And of course they wanted the countries to choose the United States, but if countries did not choose the United States, the implication that the inference that Americans drew from this was that you were choosing the Soviet side. So it's really our way or the highway. And in the 1960s, the Democratic administration, John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, backed away from this a little bit. But still, there was this concern in the case of Latin America that the Castro model might be catching. And so anytime it looked as though there was another Castro-type revolution that was welling up, American leaders get really nervous. In 1965, something that looked like a leftist insurgency in the Dominican Republic developed. And Lyndon Johnson, knowing that he didn't want to be the one who had let a second Cuba take hold, he was a firm believer in the no more Castros model. He sent American troops into the Dominican Republic, really before it was necessary, before there was any clear demonstration that the existing regime was going to be overthrown by communists or anything like that. But it was really to send a message, and the message was supposed to go farther than just the Dominican Republic. It was supposed to go to other countries around the region. If you guys entertain any thoughts of bringing in another communist government like that of Fidel Castro in Cuba, well, the hammer's going to come down on you. I talked in the last lecture about the Pax Americana, the whole idea of a great power imposing its order on a region of the country. So this was the position that the United States took, and the Johnson-inspired intervention in the Dominican Republic was an example of this. We'll see more in a minute. But there was another area where Americans got nervous as well, and this was in the Panama Canal zone. So Panama was a country actually that was created almost at the behest of Theodore Roosevelt. Panama originally had been a part of Colombia, but when Colombia wouldn't play ball with Roosevelt, Roosevelt was trying to get an agreement as to a location for a canal across the isthmus in what would become Panama. And the Colombian government was asking for too much money in Roosevelt's eyes. So Roosevelt hears that there is a group in Panama that wants to make Panama independent of Colombia. So he backs this Panamanian revolution. And the Panamanian leaders, they declare their independence. Roosevelt sends a warship and guarantees that the revolution will succeed. In gratitude, in exchange, the new government of Panama grants the United States a lease, a 99-year lease on this Panama Canal zone. And that's where the Panama Canal is constructed. And all goes well for a while until the 1960s. And in the 1960s, groups within Panama look at what's happening in Cuba and the emergence of Castro. Castro was a very charismatic figure who really had a lot of appeal for younger people, being a relatively young guy himself, for younger people in Latin America. And for Panamanians who had lived with this American presence in their small country for a long time, Fidel Castro was the guy to listen to, because the American Panama Canal Zone bisected Panama, and it was conceived of as American territory. Panamanians had no right as Panamanians to go into the canal zone, so a large chunk of their country was essentially off limits to Panamanians. And so Panamanians during the 1960s, at least a group of Panamanians who considered themselves Panamanian nationalists, again, the same principle, get these big foreign powers out of our country, were agitating for changes in the U.S. relationship with Panama to get the Americans out. Now, there were still 30 years to run on the agreement, and the government of the United States was in no mood, for example, to cede control of the Panama Canal over to the government of Panama, especially if it looked like it might be a leftist government of Panama. The Panama Canal was simply too vital to American commerce and American security. So, what's the government of the United States going to do? Well, Lyndon Johnson decides that negotiations will begin. We'll talk about this. And there's no hurry in the negotiations because the United States has this deal that lasts until the 1990s. But we'll talk. And this was Johnson's way of trying to defuse the situation. He didn't want to say, no, we'll never discuss this, you're never going to get the Panama Canal back. Just say, we'll talk about it. And these talks can go on for a long time. The other thing is that Johnson had only so much bandwidth to deal with foreign policy. And that bandwidth was filled with the Vietnam War. So he didn't really want to devote a lot of effort to what was going on in Panama. And the talks went on and on and on. And they actually culminated during Jimmy Carter's presidency in the 1970s. And they culminated in a treaty, a new deal, that said that at the end of the agreement that had started in the beginning of the century, the Panama Canal would revert to Panamanian control. There was a lot of talk in the United States saying that the Panama Canal must never be allowed to go over to Panamanian control. It's so important to the United States that it must always remain in American hands. And so therefore, the goal of the United States in these negotiations must be to extend the lease. So the United States gets another 99 years. So this was one argument. Carter didn't pursue that because he recognized two things. One, that by the 1970s, the importance of the Panama Canal was much less than it had been. Bigger ships were being built than could go through the Panama Canal, especially tankers, big super tankers. They couldn't fit through the Panama Canal anymore, and so it wasn't an issue for them. The other thing that Carter recognized more and more quickly than some other people who considered themselves more realists in foreign policy was that The Panama Canal would be really hard to defend against a determined insurgency in Panama, because a canal, the Panama Canal, is a relatively narrow waterway, and if you sink a ship in the Panama Canal, you can block the canal. This is what happened during the Six-Day War in the Middle East. Ships were sunk in the Suez Canal, and it took forever to clear them out. So it would be possible for insurgents to close the canal by sinking a ship that was passing through the canal, or blowing up some of the locks, or something like that. So the canal would be really hard and expensive to defend against a determined insurgency. Carter recognized this. And so what he decided to do was to basically bring the Panamanians in on the action. So make sure that Panama gets the canal, but then Panama, therefore, has an incentive to defend the canal. The United States government never really had a huge interest in operating the canal. The United States government didn't want to be in the canal operating business. What the United States government wanted to do is to make sure that the canal would always be available to American shipping. And so Carter reasoned that hand the canal over to the Panamanians. They'll be the ones now who will make the money from the tolls charged ships going through the canal. And they'll have every incentive to keep the canal up to date, to keep the canal secure. So the more ships that go through, the more money they make. And it was a very controversial move on Carter's part in the 1970s, the late 1970s, during the Carter administration. But it was something that actually paid off. And 20 years later, when the canal did go over to Panamanian control, the transition happened smoothly, and the Panama Canal has never been particularly challenged since then. In fact, the Panamanian government has invested a great deal of money in expanding the Panama Canal so it can handle these bigger ships. There's a maximum size of ships that can go through the Panama Canal. It's called Panamax. And these Panamax ships were bigger, and so the canal could do more business into the future. So time would show that Carter's approach to Latin America worked out in the case of Panama. But his approach to other issues in Latin America was hotly contested. So, I mean, the Panama Canal issue was contested too, particularly by Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, the Republican nominee for president in 1980, a Republican conservative, a Cold War hawk, had been criticizing Carter's administration toward Latin America from the time Carter became president. And he harshly challenged Carter's position on the Panama Canal, taking the position, we built the canal, now you're going to give it away. No, he didn't think that should happen. He couldn't prevent it, though, and it did happen, and it all turned out okay from the standpoint of the canal and American interest there, and one could say Panamanian interest there. It was a success story in diplomacy, but the success isn't going to come till later. But Reagan gets elected president in 1980, and he has been criticizing Carter for Carter's handling of a revolution in Nicaragua, the Sandinista revolution, where a leftist movement, modeling itself to some degree on the Castro revolution in Cuba, decides to overthrow an autocratic government that had become despotic, that had become corrupt, very much like the Cuban government that Castro had overthrown. And Carter has to figure out how to deal with this. And Carter took the position, Carter with his emphasis on human rights, criticized the existing Nicaraguan government for human rights violations. Carter took the position that sometimes change is necessary, as difficult, as worrisome as it might be for a country of the status quo like the United States. So Carter largely stood aside while the revolution in Nicaragua unfolded and led to the overthrow of the Nicaraguan government and the installment of this new government that governed under the umbrella of the Sandinista movement. So this is the government that Ronald Reagan inherits when he becomes president at the beginning of 1981. And for Reagan, this is intolerable. Reagan cannot stand the idea of leftists, and the Sandinistas included a large number of leftists in control of a country so close to the Panama Canal, so close to American shores. But just the principle that a country in America's backyard, and this was the way that American leaders often thought of Latin America, but especially the Caribbean basin, I should add. This was the way the Romans thought of the Mediterranean. The Roman backyard, well, the Caribbean, was like the Roman Mediterranean. It was America's backyard. And American leaders, especially conservatives, especially opponents of the Sandinistas, talked this way all the time. Well, Reagan went beyond talk. And Reagan supported an insurgency against the leftist regime in Nicaragua. Now, this was a big deal. This was a change from previous policy, a change, in fact, from American policy in the Cold War generally. I should remind you that we're in the 1980s, so the Cold War is still going on. And the Nicaraguans, like the Cubans, are looking to the Soviet Union for assistance, which was their sovereign right to do. And Reagan really pushed American anti-communist policy farther than it had ever gone before. Under Truman, under the Truman Doctrine, the United States would support, well, what they called free governments who were challenged by communist insurgencies. So the Truman administration would uphold an anti-communist status quo. But that was as far as Truman was willing to go. In the case of China and Taiwan, the Truman administration did not go all in, and the communists took over. And the Truman administration subsequently refused to support Taiwanese, I should say, the Chinese nationalists who went to Taiwan when they agitated for a reopening of the Chinese Civil War. Truman says, no, we're not going to do that. Truman took the position that the United States will support existing anti-communist governments, but will not try to overthrow existing communist governments. Reagan pushes things farther than that. So something that comes to be called the Reagan Doctrine says that's exactly what the United States will do. The United States will work to overthrow left-leaning, possibly communist governments. So Truman's policy was to contain communism. Reagan's policy was to shrink the area controlled by communism. And Nicaragua was a prime example. So the Reagan administration supported this insurgency, calling itself the Contras, Contra Spanish for against. So it was the group against the Nicaraguan government. And this was a controversial policy because Democrats in Congress didn't agree with the policy. It was a policy that was cooked up by the president, by his administration. This demonstrated that Congress has only modest control of foreign policy. In theory, Congress controls the purse strings, and if you can't pay for a foreign policy, you're not going to get the foreign policy. But that's theoretical. As the case of Nicaragua demonstrated, especially the Iran-Contra scandal demonstrated, Congress can pull the plug on spending on a program, as it did for Reagan's Contra program. Reagan was providing support to the Contras in Nicaragua. And this got very controversial when the CIA, in league with the Contras, installed submarine mines, these are explosive underwater, in one of the ports of Nicaragua, and therefore endangering shipping that had nothing to do with the war there. And so Congress pulled the plug on the funding for the Contra War. And the Reagan administration did an end run around, found money elsewhere to keep the Contras going. Reagan considered it, he spoke of it openly, as a moral obligation the United States had. He said, you know, I told the Contras that I would support them, and I'm going to do my best to continue supporting them. He said, if the United States doesn't support them, they will be captured and probably punished, perhaps executed in some cases, by the Nicaraguan government. The United States has its credibility on the line, it has its code of morality. This was the position that Reagan took. Well, anyway, so the Contra War kind of stumbled when the cover story, the story of the Iran-Contra scandal, broke. And it turned out that the Reagan administration was funneling profits from the illegal sale of weapons to Iran in violation of American law and American policy, and taking the profits and using them to fund the Contras. The United States also was putting the squeeze on American allies. And so if Congress won't fund the Contras, the United States influence some of America's allies. You guys fund them, and we'll pay you back some other way. So the Contra War went ahead just sort of half-heartedly for years. And before it came to a conclusion, Reagan and the United States had other issues to deal with. And here I'm going to move more from security issues to economic issues, but also issues touching on a long-standing concern of Americans regarding Latin America, and especially regarding Mexico, and that is immigration. Now, just a quick rundown on America's immigration policy historically. From independence in 1776 until the beginning of the 20th century, the United States overall had an open-door policy regarding immigration. There was an important exception to this. In the 1880s, Congress passed a law limiting immigration, actually banning immigration of Chinese workers. Chinese students, Chinese business people, professionals could still come, but Chinese workers could not. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act, it started in the 1880s and it continued into the 20th century. But for the rest, until the 1920s, the United States largely said, come on in, the more people the better. And this was because there was a broad belief, not a universal belief, but a broad belief that the United States benefited from immigration. These were willing workers who wanted to come, adopt American ways, take jobs, expand the American economy, and just make the United States a more vibrant place. Things changed in the 1920s, in part as a reaction to World War I, in part due to sort of the long buildup of concern that these foreigners were making the United States too foreign, that immigrants no longer looked like the native-born Americans, and that they were taking American jobs. This was a chronic concern, at least this was a statement, repeatedly expressed by opponents of immigration. So in 1924, the United States passed the first comprehensive immigration reform measure, and it placed a quota on immigration, an overall quota, and the quota was parceled out among particular countries. So country A would get so many, and country B would get so many, and so on. And this was the American attitude toward immigration from the 1920s to the 1960s. But the countries that had immigration control did not include the countries of Latin America, and especially Mexico. And this in large part because farmers in the border states, especially the border states, but some other states as well, Texas, New Mexico, California, they wanted to make sure they had workers. And the workers were often migrant farm workers. So they would come across the border, they'd work during the season, then they'd go home. And immigration control might get in the way of this. So this concern for immigrants, but the broader concern about immigrants making the United States too foreign, and the concern that immigrants were taking American jobs, this had a long-standing background. But it wasn't applied directly to immigrants from, especially Mexico. I'll focus on Mexico because that's where most of the migrant farm workers came from. It didn't focus on Mexico. There was an immigration reform in the 1960s that changed things in a number of ways. It allowed the reunification of families, and it provided for immigrants who had particular skills. And it really changed the complexion, literally changed the complexion of the immigrants to the United States. So in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, when a special exemption was made for Vietnamese refugees, a lot of people from Vietnam came to the United States. And under the family unification provision of this law, once one member of family arrived, then other members of the family could come, and other members and other members. And so a lot of this was unanticipated, even unintended. But it is something that really changed immigration. But by the 1980s, the numbers of immigrants coming from Mexico to the United States alarmed many people. And a lot of the immigration was undocumented. The term was often illegal, but these immigrants came from Mexico outside the normal immigration rules. And so the question is, what are we going to do about them? Now, there was sufficient agreement on what a reasonable immigration reform measure would take that during the Reagan administration, immigration reform was passed. I'll add that this was the last important major piece of immigrant legislation. This is in the 1980s. And immigration has been an issue ever since. But in the 1980s and into the 1990s, there was this concern, well, what do we do to keep immigrants from coming into the United States despite American laws forbidding them to come in? And everybody understood the big draw was jobs in the United States. Immigrants historically have come to the United States primarily for economic opportunity. In the early days, before the Industrial Revolution, economic opportunity usually meant get a farm. Some came in for religious freedom, some came in response to religious persecution. There were refugees, there were immigrants, but by and large, the attraction of the United States was the economic opportunity in the United States. After the Industrial Revolution, the economic opportunity takes the form of jobs, sometimes jobs in industry, in factories and the like, in mines, but also jobs along the border and on farms. And it reflected the fact that certainly by the mid-20th century, the American standard of living, the per capita income in the United States, was way higher than that in Mexico or the countries of Central America and a lot of other countries. People weren't leaving rich countries to come to the United States, they were leaving poor countries to come to the United States. And so there was a school of thought that said, I mean, basically, to put it bluntly, how do we keep so many Mexicans from climbing the fence, from swimming the Rio Grande and coming into the United States? Why are they coming here? They're coming here to get jobs. They're coming here for greater economic opportunity. What if there were greater economic opportunity for Mexicans in Mexico? What if the United States collaborated with Mexico in improving the Mexican economy? So this was a principal motive behind what came to be called the North American Free Trade Agreement. Under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which I talked about earlier in an earlier lecture, and the principle of free trade, the United States had reduced tariffs from countries around the world. But there was always a concern, there was always a question. So if you want to make progress on free trade, should you insist that the progress apply to all countries of the world at the same time? Or would it be better to focus on particular regions of the world, particular groups of countries? Because maybe you could make more progress with those particular groups of countries in these small regions, and then the principle would catch on. If free trade works, let's say, in North America, if free trade works between the United States and Mexico and Canada, then other countries will see, boy, free trade is this good thing, and they'll follow that lead. So there were two schools of thought on this subject. And the latter one that says, okay, if we can't get free trade toward the whole world at once, because the free traders, this is what they basically wanted. But it was a hard problem and not everybody wanted to go at the same speed. Let's focus on North America. Now, from the standpoint of the United States, there were the two countries that were going to join the United States in NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, were Mexico and Canada. And the issues were different between those two. So in the case of Mexico, from the American standpoint, we're going to try to get more jobs in Mexico so we get fewer immigrants from Mexico. And this will prevent the immigration reform of the 1980s from being overrun by a new reality. So this was one of the influences. But to make it clear that this wasn't simply a bilateral US-Mexico thing, Canada was involved as well. Now, this also reflected the fact that Canada was a major trading partner for the United States. Canada is a large country geographically, slightly larger than the United States, but it is very much smaller than the United States by population. And so Canada is about the size of, its population roughly the size of California, or a little bit bigger than Texas. But Canada's economy was a closer fit to the economy of the United States. And typically, trade agreements work best when the two countries have comparable economies, or at least when the economies of the countries are complementary. And so this is something that gave rise to the North American Free Trade Agreement. And NAFTA, as it was called, was negotiated by the Bush administration, the elder Bush administration. It was signed and took effect under the Clinton administration. And it was greeted with great fanfare during the early 1990s. This was an age when there was still a lot of enthusiasm for globalization, for free trade, for what freer trade among nations, the reduction of barriers to trade, would involve. There was an idea that where trade crosses boundaries, immigrants don't have to. This was a variant on the earlier version of where trade crosses boundaries, soldiers don't. But the whole idea was that the economies of the three major North American economies could all fit together in this nice trading bloc. And, well, in the judgment of the supporters, NAFTA was a great success. It increased trade among the three countries, and it boosted the economy of Mexico. It helped the economy of Canada as well, but it had its critics, and by this time there were critics of globalization generally, who said, in fact, they had criticized NAFTA from the start, saying, wait a minute, American jobs are simply going to go to Mexico. And so this is not a good thing. So NAFTA, as successful as it was in North America in its early years, prompted a backlash that administrations, starting with the Clinton administration, but administrations since the Clinton presidency, have had to deal with. And we're still grappling with the aftermath of this and the anti-globalization backlash.